We are airing this prior footage for the first time on The Beat. And I want you here as part of our special report to really take this in. Take a look at Jack Smith's detailed explanation.
We don't want to live in a society where someone is convicted based on what's in the newspapers. I can tell you very often we have cases that we investigate where there are allegations in the newspapers which, if those allegations were true, and if those allegations were the complete story, I could see why the average American would think that is corrupt. But we don't want to live in a society of a form of mob rule where we just get a few allegations without any process, convict somebody. But I think that's the role of the prosecutors, to take allegations like that when they're public and investigate and see if the facts actually back up what's there. Is the allegation and the source of it credible?
Let the facts lead. Make sure it's credible, and don't do a lot of public hype through the media or otherwise in advance. Now, he was saying all that before taking on this special counsel role. It's just interesting tonight to see that, well, it seems he's been consistent. That's how he described it then, and that's how he's been acting and living through this role. Defendant Trump, not the first head of state that Smith has put on trial either. That's experience you may have heard about. The Attorney General knew of it when he recruited Jack Smith for this post after his past prosecution of a sitting head of state. Here's some background on that.
But now his past has caught up with him.
The president of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi, is in The Hague for an interview with prosecutors who have indicted him on war crimes charges.
He's been charged with 10 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Jack Smith led that high-stakes case. And we actually have some of this rare footage of Smith making the case in court, leading the prosecution. And before I show it to you as part of this report, let me remind you, this is something we have not even seen yet in any of the Trump hearings thus far. Smith overseeing other experienced prosecutors to do this. But how did he get to oversee them? How did he get to this post? By doing this many times in the past. Here we're going to see how he does it. Jack Smith, striking a pretty calm and persistent posture, sober, in the courtroom, prosecuting alleged war crimes.
The truth will be laid before this court in the coming weeks.
My office will be unrelenting and unstopping. Fair administration of justice requires building and fostering institutions that can protect those who seek justice.
Mr. Mustafa used their power to victimize and to brutalize fellow Kosovar Albanians. No justification whatsoever for the inhumane conditions under which they were held, or for the manner in which they were brutalized and tortured during their detainment. Watch this trial and watch those that follow. Watch how this court functions and then judge. There can never be an expiration date on accountability. You will hear from victims who have waited 2 decades to be heard. The charges here do not directly concern the events of the war in Kosovo occurring over 20 years ago. They concern attempts to intimidate people into not telling this court what happened to them 20 years ago, and attempts to obstruct the work of this institution at any cost.
It's pretty striking. Facing those documented horrors, that horror that people were put through to live through, and that quest for what justice might look like, you see Jack Smith's approach. He could have been more dramatic. There was obviously pathos, drama, and sadness in what happened. He could have been louder. But he took that measured path. That was his approach. He also argued in that same trial that the authoritarian tried to use lies and exploit propaganda and the media as part of his criminal plots. Now, that might sound familiar here on the home front. It's a point that actually echoes in Jack Smith's coup indictment of Trump. And while the U.S. Constitution does value a free press, which makes up its own minds with its freedom, in that very case, as prosecutor, Smith was careful to note something quite important, at least in the view of the law, that while the journalists would make up their own minds, many journalists there rejected fraudulent and propaganda documents from the accused. Take a listen. Here is Smith in this rare court footage.
The accused in committing their crimes tried to amplify
the damage they caused by exhorting the media in Kosovo to publish ethical journalists of Kosovo who refused to publish the documents that the accused attempted to provide them.
Jack Smith couldn't have known, no one could have necessarily known how big a deal fraudulent documents furnished in various intermediaries and through the press and through politicians and hacks and lawyers and ultimately, well, in America, ultimately pushed all the way up trying to get it into Vice President Pence's hands on January 6th. He couldn't have known the parallels here, but there they are. At the Justice Department, I can tell you Jack Smith's last big job before this one was leading the unit that prosecutes corrupt politicians, the Public Integrity Department. It's a post that he'd actually prepared for with prior prosecutions of abuse of government, regardless of whether they were controversial or unpopular in the public realm, like a victorious prosecution and trial of a police officer who abused Abner Louima, garnering a 30-year prison sentence, which at the time was unheard of for officers and unpopular among some prosecutors who work so closely with police and FBI. But Smith went right at it, just like he's taken on top figures in both parties. Consider someone who was once the Democratic Party's national rising star before a rapid fall. You may remember Senator and Vice Presidential nominee John Edwards. Jack Smith led that prosecution in 2011.
John and I are honest and realistic with the American people.
The story that's sending shockwaves through the presidential campaign. After months of denials, former candidate John Edwards admitted today that he had an extramarital affair while his wife was battling cancer.
The fall from grace for Democrat John Edwards was just as stunning. And tonight, a new low. After a federal grand jury in North Carolina charged him with 6 felonies.
A new low takes you back to grand jury proceedings there that were moving apace against, at the time, someone in the other party, Democratic, than now, where we followed a lot of those against Republican Donald Trump. Smith oversaw the case. And later, in the context of these types of cases in general, not just Edwards, but the tricky balancing issues and lines when you deal with politicians and corruption, he explained that a fair prosecution for corruption does require intent. We've heard a lot about criminal intent in his current coup case, and that proving that can be hard. He recounted how government officials, though, can be in denial about their methods, their intent, and the problems they have.
What was that person's intent? Did they do this for that? Did they act corruptly? Oftentimes, when I go to speak to folks about their corruption programs and what sort of cases they're doing, oftentimes I go places and the first thing I hear is, no, we don't have a corruption problem here, Jack. And my immediate reaction is, you definitely have a corruption problem there.
Some legal guffaws there, because what Smith is getting at is every place where there's power and money and any kind of temptation will have at least the possibility of those problems or corruption. So if you don't think you're even susceptible to it, or anyone in your entire department is, then you're probably more susceptible than usual. Now, in the Edwards case, that theory was using illegal campaign donations to conceal a mistrust from voters, and that theory fell apart at trial. Edwards was found not guilty in a verdict on one charge, a mistrial on the others. DOJ did not retry that case. So 3 quick points there. 1, Jack Smith was nonpartisan. 2, he was clearly aggressive, so aggressive he didn't actually win over the jury on that case. And 3, and this is so important right now, especially as Trump allies and others want to make up stories or tell you narratives or outright lies about DOJ and FBI or Jack Smith without any look at the record. And our point here in this special report is to look factually at the record, including the loss, the Edwards loss. But the third piece here is that Smith has a demonstrated respect for legal limits, a kind of measured, professional humility. And again, we've gone through all this and picked out the key footage for you. This is something he has spoken about in the sometimes baffling legal lines that are drawn for pursuing politicians.
The folks who commit these crimes are sophisticated individuals, and by and large, they give the money and receive the money, or give and receive the benefits in all sorts of complicated forms that make it not nearly as stark, not nearly as easy to report in 5 lines in a newspaper article. And because of that, because of how these crimes are committed, because they're often committed by sophisticated people with great means. We do need laws that are broad enough to reach conduct. I mean, right now, under the Honest Services Statute as it exists, we cannot charge undisclosed conflicts of interest. So just imagine, just to follow up on that scenario, you have a mayor and he takes bribes for city contracts. He takes bribes, he puts the money in his pocket, and he gives someone a contract who shouldn't have got that contract. Those average American taxpayers are not getting what they paid for. I can prosecute that case. That's bribery. I can prosecute that mayor, and I think everyone would think that we should. That same mayor says, you know what? I don't want the bribes. I want more money. I'm going to start my own company, and I'm going to hide my interest in it, and I'm going to funnel the contracts to me. I can't prosecute that case. And I think the average American, in terms of what's wrong, if you believe those facts, if those facts in an objective investigation are brought to light, I think that average American wants the Department of Justice.
Really important point there that he makes. I played it in full so you could really absorb it. He says, I can't prosecute that case. He also makes it clear that he thinks it would be good policy to be able to prosecute that case, and goes so far as to say he thinks most Americans would agree that if the politicians are blatantly self-dealing or doing corrupt things, that's what the corruption laws ought to be for. That sounds rational. But notice where he draws the line. He cannot go beyond that. He doesn't say, so we looked for a loophole or a trick, or we threw a different charge at him to make up for it, or the ends justify the means, or any of the stuff that you don't want anyone in power, especially the power to indict, to prosecute, to jail, to seek any level of punishment. You don't want those people playing fast and loose. And so it is striking. I wanted you to hear, as we go through the footage, that Jack Smith did quite the opposite. He will say quite clearly, you might want to go farther. It might sound like corruption, but I can't go beyond what the Honest Services Statute says, full stop. That's how he approached those high-profile cases. And he's got the highest profile case not only of his career life, but, as Andrew Weissmann and others have said, probably the most important trial in the history of the United States.